3 weeks after her husband took everything. The house, the car, 30 years of her labor. Eleanor Whitfield used her last dollar to buy an abandoned restaurant on a street she had never driven down before the day her marriage ended. She opened a storage room door at the back of the kitchen. Inside were 31 jars with her grandmother's name on them. She did not know it yet. But those jars were about to trigger the downfall of the man who had spent 18 months making sure she had nothing. He missed one thing, the one thing that was about to destroy him. People in Staunton had already stopped asking about her. The women at the club where she once hosted Garrett's client dinners had removed her from the group text within a week of the filing. The neighbors on Bellevue Drive, the ones she had cooked for every Christmas for 22 years, sent a single card and then went quiet. When a man with lawyers and a corner office decides a woman is finished, the world tends to agree. But what they did not know, what Garrett himself would not understand until it was far too late, was that the thing he left her with, the one asset he considered too small to take, was the only thing that mattered. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you stories about people who lose everything and find the one thing nobody thought was worth taking, take a moment and subscribe. It costs nothing, and it means we get to keep telling these. Nell grew up in the kitchen on Combs Hollow Road in Millbrook, Virginia. The house sat at the end of a dirt road that turned to mud every March and froze solid every January. And her grandmother, Hazel May Combs, stood in that kitchen every morning before the sun cleared the Blue Ridge and did not leave it until the last dish was washed and put away. The kitchen was where everything real happened in that house, where the news got discussed, where the neighbors came when something broke or someone died or a child was sick and the doctor was 40 minutes away, where food came out of almost nothing and fed everyone who showed up, and people showed up often, because Hazel's kitchen smelled like a place where you were welcome, whether you had been invited or not. Hazel made the apple butter, not the kind that comes in a jar from a factory with a label designed by someone who has never peeled an apple in their life, the kind that takes all day. The kind that starts with bushels of wine sap and stamen from the orchard behind the house, hand-peeled, hand-cored, slow-cooked in a copper kettle over low heat with cinnamon and clove, and the patience that most people mistake for stubbornness. Hazel had been making it since before Nell was born. The recipe had been in the family for 2 generations before her, written on cards that had been rewritten so many times. The original handwriting was lost. But the flavor was not lost. The flavor was the thing that stayed. There was always something underneath the cinnamon and clove that Nell could taste, but never named, dark and sweet and older than the recipe itself, as though the apples remembered something the cook had never written down. She started bottling it when Nell was 11, because the neighbors kept asking, and Hazel decided that if they were going to ask that many times, she might as well make it official. Each jar sealed with wax by hand, each wax cap stamped with the letters C and H pressed into the soft surface with a brass seal. Hazel's husband had made from a spent rifle casing. Combs Hollow Original. The name meant the road. It meant the kitchen. It meant a woman who stood in front of a stove for 50 years and never once called what she did a business, even though that is exactly what it was. When Nell left Millbrook at 23 for Staunton, her grandmother put 2 things in her hands: a recipe book handwritten, every page full, 30 years of cooking recorded in Hazel's careful slanted script, and a small photograph tucked inside the front cover. Hazel standing in front of the Combs Hollow kitchen in 1985, 33 years old, a jar of apple butter in each hand, smiling like she knew something nobody else knew yet. Nell carried both for 30 years. She carried them through a marriage, 2 children, 22 years in the same house, and a life that looked from the outside like something she had chosen. She had chosen it. That was the part that kept her up at night after it ended. She had looked at Garrett Whitfield when she was 25 years old and seen a man with a plan, and she had believed his plan, and her instincts were the same thing. They were not. She married him in 1991. He was persuasive and organized, and he had a way of making decisions sound like shared agreements, even when they were nothing of the kind. For 30 years, she ran the household. Raised Colleen and Nolan, entertained his clients at dinners she planned, and cooked and cleaned up after alone, and managed the books for his real estate firm without a salary or a title. Every connection Garrett had in the Shenandoah Valley came through meals she prepared and conversations she kept alive while he shook hands and talked numbers in the next room. She built the foundation of his professional life with her hands and her time and her intelligence. Her name was on none of it, not on the firm, not on the accounts, not on the deed to the house they had lived in for 22 years. She had signed papers over the years without reading them carefully, because that is what you do when you trust someone, when you have no reason not to trust someone. You sign, you move on, you put dinner on the table. Garrett started planning the divorce 2 years before he served the papers. He had met someone at the firm, a woman 28 years younger, who saw in Garrett what Nell had once seen before she understood what was underneath. His lawyer spent 18 months restructuring what could be restructured. The house went through a refinancing that transferred the deed into Garrett's name only. Nell had signed that closing. She remembered the pen in her hand. She did not remember anyone explaining what she was actually signing away. The business accounts were structured to make her contribution invisible. The savings moved to accounts bearing only his name. The investments locked in a trust naming Garrett as sole beneficiary. By the time Nell's lawyer got involved, Garrett's team had an 18-month head start. The $22,000 left in the joint checking account was the one thing they missed. Everything else was already legally unreachable. She walked out of 30 years with $22,000, an old car, her clothes, and her grandmother's recipe book. She kept $1,000 as a buffer. 3 weeks later, she was driving through the back roads west of Staunton, with no destination in mind. The radio was off. The windows were down. October air came through, smelling like fallen leaves and the last of the season's warmth. Warmth, and Nell drove without thinking about where she was going, because for the first time in 30 years, nobody was expecting her anywhere. She passed through Millbrook without meaning to. She had not been here in years. The road was the same. The hills were the same. The orchards on either side had thinned. Some sold off, some just left to grow wild, but the shape of the valley was exactly as she remembered it. On the far end of the main street, she passed a shuttered building. The windows were papered over from inside. The wooden sign above the door had faded until only the ghost of the lettering remained. A for sale notice was taped to the glass, the paper curling at the edges from weather. Nell passed it. Then she stopped the car. She sat there for a while, looking at the building in her rearview mirror. She did not know why she stopped. She would think about that later many times, and never arrive at an answer that satisfied her. She just stopped. She got out and walked to the door. The sign, when she looked at it closely, read, Opal's Table, in letters that had once been painted burgundy. Below it, smaller family cooking since 1982. She cupped her hands against the glass and looked inside. A dining room with 8 tables, still in place, chairs stacked on top. A counter with a glass case empty, dust on every surface. But the bones were there. The ceiling was intact. The floor was worn but solid. Through the kitchen door, she could see the edge of a stainless steel prep table and the corner of a commercial stove. The phone number on the for sale notice had a local area code. She called it from the sidewalk. The building was Opal's Table, a comfort food restaurant that had fed the town of Millbrook and half the valley for 20 years before it closed 8 years ago. The owner, Miss Opal Driscoll, 83 years old, living in a care home in Waynesboro, had been trying to sell it for 4 years. Nobody wanted it. The kitchen equipment was old. The town had gotten smaller. Every month she held it cost her money she did not have. Nell offered $21,000, $10,000 below the asking price. Miss Opal said yes before Nell finished the sentence. 21,000 in hand was better than 31,000 that had not come in 4 years. Nell bought the building on a Thursday morning. She walked through it alone that afternoon. The kitchen was dusty but intact. The dining room needed work, but the structure was sound. Afternoon light came through the west-facing windows and lay across the floor in long rectangles, catching the dust as she stirred up as she moved through the rooms. She had a notepad in her hand and a list of things to check. Equipment that was functional, equipment that needed replacing, measurements for the kitchen, costs she could not yet afford. She was doing the math in her head, the same way she had done Garrett's books for 30 years, except now the numbers were hers, and the margin for error was zero. At the back of the kitchen was a door she had not planned to open. It was not on her list. It was just a storage room. She opened it anyway. The light from the kitchen fell across the threshold and stopped at her feet. Beyond it, the room was dim. Broken chairs stacked against one wall. Old equipment draped in cloth. Boxes of paper supplies gone soft with age. 8 years of nobody coming in here. 8 years of a door staying shut. Against the back wall, covered in canvas sheeting gone gray with dust, were wooden crates. She almost walked past them. She almost told herself it was old equipment and nothing more, and turned back to her notepad and her list. She walked to them instead. She pulled the canvas back with one hand. Underneath were jars, 31 of them, each one sealed with wax, each wax cap bearing the impression of 2 letters pressed into the surface with something small and precise. CH. Each one bearing a handwritten label in ink that had faded but not disappeared. She picked one up. She held it close to the light coming through the doorway. She read the label. Combs Hollow Original. Hazel May Combs. Millbrook, Virginia. Nell stood in that storage room at the back of a restaurant she had bought with her last dollar in a town she had not visited in years, with her grandmother's name in her hands. She did not make a sound. The air in the room smelled like old wood and dust, and something underneath both of those things that she could not immediately name. Then she could. Cinnamon and clove. Faint. Almost gone. But there, she had $21,000 to her name. She had bought this building 3 weeks after her husband served her divorce papers. She had opened this door expecting nothing. She had not expected this. Standing there the second time, knowing now who she is. What was taken from her, what $21,000 means when it is everything you have left the label on those jars hit differently. This was not luck. A woman who had lost everything did not stumble into a storage room and find her grandmother's name on a jar by accident. This was 30 years of a life that could not be reduced to a deed or an account balance or a trust document. Hazel's apple butter ended up in this building because Hazel built something real, something that outlasted her, something that found its way across years and closed doors and an 8-year silence to the one person it was always meant for. Nell just had to show up. She did show up, with $21,000 and the recipe book and nothing else to lose. Inside one of the crates beneath the jars was a folder. Manila soft at the edges, held closed with a rubber band that broke the moment Nell touched it. Inside, correspondence between Hazel and Miss Opal going back 15 years. Monthly orders, handwritten notes in Hazel's slanted script about which batches had cooked longer and tasted better for it. Which ones needed more time in the kettle. Which ones she had added an extra handful of stamen to because the wine saps that year had been too sweet. Notes from Miss Opal in return, customer reactions requests for larger jars align in one letter that read, "Your apple butter is the only reason Dottie Farnham comes in on Tuesdays and she has not missed a Tuesday in 6 years. And beneath the correspondence, at the bottom of the folder, 3 pages that were not handwritten. They were typed. Official, notarized. Manufacturing and distribution agreements, signed and dated, assigning the rights to the Combs Hollow original brand recipes. Name production methods and all associated intellectual property to Hazel May Combs and her direct heirs. The date on the agreements was October 14th, 1985. Nell read them twice. She understood they were important. She did not yet understand how important. She took the folder home. She did not sleep well. She lay in the dark in the rented room she had been staying in since the divorce. The folder on the nightstand beside her. The recipe book beside the folder. The photograph of Hazel still tucked inside the front cover, where it had been for 30 years. She thought about the wax seals on those jars, the care it took to press each one by hand, the brass stamp Hazel's husband had made from a rifle casing, the 2 letters, CH, pressed into warm wax 31 times, then left in the dark for 8 years waiting. In the morning, she called a lawyer. The lawyer's office was on Beverly Street in Staunton, above a hardware store, in a building that smelled like old radiators and floor polish. The lawyer's name was Fay Beckford. She was 52 direct, and she read documents the way some people read novels, slowly, carefully, and with the understanding that every word had been chosen for a reason. Nell sat across the desk and laid the folder out between them and waited. Fay read through everything. The correspondence, the notes, the agreements. She read the notarized signatures. She checked the dates. Then she looked up. Her voice was steady, the way someone speaks when they want to make sure every word lands exactly where it should. Inherited brand rights assigned before marriage are separate property under Virginia law. This agreement was signed in October 1985. You married Garrett Whitfield in June 1981. The agreement predates your marriage by nearly 6 years. Your grandmother died in 2017. You are her only surviving direct heir. She paused, then quieter but no less certain. The brand is yours, clean, legally sound. Nobody can touch it. Nell sat with that for a while. She did not answer immediately. 31 jars of apple butter in a storage room nobody had opened in 8 years. Her grandmother's name on every label. Her grandmother's signature on every agreement. Sitting there in the dark for 8 years waiting for the one person they belonged to. She asked Fay how much the brand might be worth. Fay did not know yet, but she knew who to ask. What she did know was that the first step was to file for formal ownership to register the inherited brand rights in Nell's name, to make the claim legal and public. Nell agreed. The paperwork was filed that week. When a legal filing becomes public record, it becomes visible to anyone who is looking. Most people are not looking. Most filings go unnoticed in the daily accumulation of paperwork that moves through county offices and state databases. But some people set alerts. Some people have teams whose job is to watch for specific names, specific categories, specific brands that have gone quiet and might someday surface again. Edmund Mercer's team had an alert set for any legal activity connected to the Combs Hollow original brand. They had been looking for it for 3 years. They had tracked it to Millbrook. They had found that Hazel May Combs died in 2017. They could not find a surviving heir. The trail went cold at a farmhouse on a dirt road that had been sold to a developer 2 years after Hazel's death. No family, no forwarding address, no one left to ask. The filing triggered the alert. Edmund's office received the notification on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday, his team had identified Eleanor Whitfield née Combs as Hazel's granddaughter. By Thursday, they had contacted Fay Beckford's office. By the following week, a meeting was arranged. They met at a restaurant in Charlottesville on a Wednesday morning. The place was called Mercer's Valley Table, one of Edmund's farm-to-table restaurant on the downtown mall that smelled like roasted root vegetables and fresh bread. and something underneath that Nell recognized immediately. She did not say anything about it. She sat down and waited. Edmund Mercer was 56 years old. Born in Harrisonburg, raised in the Shenandoah Valley, the son of a woman who ran a roadside produce stand for 30 years and a father who worked the orchards. He had built Mercer Provisions from one small restaurant into the largest artisan food distribution company in Virginia, specializing in regional brands with real heritage and real stories. He had been acquiring authentic Shenandoah food brands for 8 years. Apple butters, fruit preserves, honey cider vinegars, heirloom recipes that had been passed down through families who never thought of what they made as a product, because to them it was just what you did. You cooked, you preserved, you fed people. You did not put a price tag on your grandmother's recipe. Edmund understood the difference between a product and a legacy. He built his company on that distinction. Nell had looked him up the night before. Read the profile pieces. She expected someone polished and transactional. A man who had learned to wear warmth like a jacket and take it off when the meeting was over. He was not that. He sat across from her, and before she could open the folder between them, he asked her what her grandmother's kitchen smelled like on a fall morning. Nell looked at him. She had not expected the question. She had expected numbers. She had expected an offer. She had not expected someone to ask about the smell of a kitchen that had been closed for almost a decade. Her answer came before she decided to give it cinnamon and clove, and underneath that something sweet I could never name. Cooked apples, maybe, but not just apples, something else. She never told me what. Edmund nodded slowly. His eyes did not leave hers. My mother's kitchen smelled like that too, 20 miles from your grandmother's road. I have been trying to find that flavor for 3 years. I have tasted 40 apple butters from the valley. None of them came close. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was everything his team had compiled on Combs Hollow Original. Records from the 1990s. Mentions in Shenandoah food publications. Letters from restaurants that had tried to source it after Hazel stopped producing. A handwritten note from a chef in Richmond, who wrote that he had been trying to recreate the flavor for 11 years and had never once come close. The note ended with a single line. Whatever she put in it, she took it with her. Nell turned the pages slowly. Her grandmother had built something real, something people had been looking for long after she was gone. Nobody in Nell's family had known. Hazel never hid it. Nobody ever asked. Nell had grown up beside this woman, eaten this apple butter on toast every morning of her childhood, carried the recipe book for 30 years, in a suitcase and then a closet and then a box that Garrett never once opened in 22 years of living in the same house. And she had never known that people were still searching for the taste of her grandmother's kitchen. She looked up from the folder. Edmund's voice was quiet and unhurried, the way someone speaks when they have thought about what they are going to say for a long time and have decided to say exactly what they mean. I am not here to buy you out. I am here to build something with you. Your grandmother's recipe, your name on it, my distribution, equal partnership. Nell closed the folder. She looked at the man across from her. She looked at the restaurant around them, the tables filling with the lunch crowd. The kitchen sounds, the smell of food made by someone who understood that feeding people was not a business strategy but an act of belief. She looked at the folder in front of her and thought about 31 jars sealed with wax in a dark room, and a woman who pressed 2 letters into each one by hand, and a photograph tucked inside a recipe book of a 33-year-old woman holding a jar in each hand and smiling like she knew something nobody else knew yet. Her voice carried the weight of a woman who had spent 30 years trusting the wrong person and was deciding carefully whether she was ready to trust again. I need to think about it. Edmund did not push. He did not counter. He did not fill the silence with reassurance or numbers or urgency. He simply nodded. Take your time, he said. Nell drove home through the valley. as the afternoon light turned the hills gold and copper, and the shadows of the Blue Ridge stretched across the orchards like long fingers reaching for something they could not quite hold. She drove with the folder on the passenger seat beside her, and the window cracked, and the smell of October coming through, and she did not turn on the radio. She thought about her grandmother's hands pressing wax seals onto jars in a kitchen on a dirt road. She thought about a brass stamp made from a rifle casing. She thought about a room that had been closed for 8 years, and a woman in a care home in Waynesboro who had kept those jars because throwing them away felt wrong. She thought about Garrett, about the 18 months he spent restructuring their life so that her name appeared on nothing, about the pen in her hand at the closing table, about 30 years of dinners and conversations and books, balanced and connections built. All of it, invisible, all of its structure to disappear the moment he decided she was finished. She thought about the recipe book on her nightstand, the one he never opened. Not once in 30 years. She called Edmund the next morning. She said yes. She did not know yet what was coming. She did not know that Garrett would come back for the one thing he had missed. She did not know how he would find out, or who would tell him, or what it would cost her to learn. That the person she trusted most after everything that had happened was the one who had been watching her all along. She did not know any of that yet. All she knew was the smell of cinnamon and clove in a dark room, and 31 jars with wax seals that bore her grandmother's initials, and the recipe book she had carried for 30 years without knowing what it was actually worth. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The first batch failed before it reached the jars. Nell stood in the kitchen of the building. She now owned the recipe book, open on the prep counter. Hazel's handwriting laid out in front of her, like a map to a place she should have been able to find with her eyes closed. She had the apples wine saps from an orchard outside Swoop, the closest she could find to what Hazel had used. She had the cinnamon, the cloves, the brown sugar. She had the copper-bottomed pot she found at a second-hand store in Waynesboro because she could not afford a proper kettle, and because the weight of it in her hands felt close enough to what she remembered from her grandmother's kitchen that she let herself believe it would work. It did not work. The heat was wrong. She kept it too high because she was impatient, because she wanted the smell to come back. Because standing in that kitchen with nothing cooking felt too much like standing in the house on Bellevue Drive after Garrett's lawyer had explained in language designed to sound reasonable that 30 years of her life had been restructured into someone else's name. She turned the heat up, and the apples scorched along the bottom of the pot, and the smell that filled the kitchen was not cinnamon and clove. It was char. It was failure. It was a 58-year-old woman who had watched her grandmother do this 1,000 times and could not do it once. She scraped the pot clean and started again. The second batch was closer. The apples cooked slowly this time. The color deepened. The kitchen began to smell like something she recognized. Not quite right, not quite her grandmother's kitchen, but adjacent, like hearing a song through a wall and knowing the melody but not being able to make out the words. She let it cook for 6 hours. She stirred it the way Hazel had stirred its slow circles with a wooden spoon, watching the surface for the moment when the butter thickened and the sheen changed from wet to almost matte. She spooned it into jars. She melted wax on the stove in a small saucepan and poured it carefully over each one the way she had watched Hazel do it, tilting the jar slightly so the wax ran evenly across the surface. Then she pressed the seal. She did not have the brass stamp. That was gone, lost somewhere in the decades between Hazel's kitchen and now probably in a drawer in the farmhouse that had been sold to a developer 2 years after Hazel died. She had ordered a new one from a metal worker in Lexington. It arrived in a small box lined with tissue paper, and when she held it in her hand, the weight was close but not the same. The letters were correct, CH, but the edges were too clean, too precise. Hazel's stamp had been made by hand from a spent casing, and the letters it pressed into wax had a roughness to them that no machine could replicate. She pressed it into the warm wax anyway. It held. The seal looked right. She let the jars cool overnight. In the morning, she opened one. She tasted it. She stood very still in the kitchen for a long time. Then she poured the jar down the drain. It was not her grandmother's apple butter. It was apple butter. It was fine. It was competent. But it was missing something, some depth beneath the cinnamon and clove that she could taste in her memory, but could not find in the pot. The recipe said everything that was supposed to be in it. Whatever was missing was not written down. The third batch she made at 3 in the morning because she could not sleep. She peeled apples in the dark kitchen with only the stove light on the knife moving through the skin in long spirals that fell to the cutting board like ribbon. She cooked it low and lower than before, and she added the spices in stages the way she thought she remembered Hazel doing it. Cinnamon first, then cloves after the first hour, then a second measure of cinnamon near the end. She cooked it for 8 hours. She tasted it at every stage. Each time it was closer. Each time it was not there. When she finally jarred it and sealed it and let it cool and opened it the next day, it was the best of the three. But it was still wrong. Not bad. Not even mediocre. But not Hazel's. There was a gap between what she could make and what she remembered. And the gap was not in the ingredients or the technique. It was in something the recipe did not contain. She sat on the back step of the restaurant with the jar in her lap and looked out at the parking lot, which was not a parking lot, so much as a patch of gravel and weeds where Opal's customers had once parked their trucks. Beyond it, the hills of the valley rose green and gold in the November light. She thought about giving up. She did not use those words. She thought about what it would mean to keep failing in a kitchen that smelled almost like her grandmother's, but was not. To keep making something that was almost right, but was not. To keep pressing wax seals onto jars of something that tasted like the memory of the thing rather than the thing itself. She drove to Waynesboro the next morning. The care home was a low brick building set back from the road behind a row of dogwoods that had already dropped their leaves. The hallway smelled like floor cleaner and reheated coffee and the particular quiet of a place where people live slowly. Nell signed in at the front desk and followed a nurse to a room at the end of the east wing. Miss Opal Driscoll was sitting in a chair by the window when Nell came in. She was small. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were sharp in a way that had nothing to do with her body, which had gotten smaller and more careful in the years since she closed the restaurant, and everything to do with the fact that Opal Driscoll had spent her whole life paying attention and had not stopped just because the world had moved her somewhere quieter. Nell sat down across from her and introduced herself. Her name, her grandmother's name. Miss Opal went completely still. Not confusion, recognition. She had been waiting to hear something for a long time and had stopped expecting it to come. Her voice was thin but steady, like thread that has been pulled tight enough to hum Hazel's granddaughter. Nell confirmed it. Miss Opal looked at her for a long moment. Then she spoke, and what she said came out not as information, but as something she had been carrying for years and was finally able to set down. She had kept those jars because she could not throw away something Hazel made with her own hands. When the restaurant closed, she locked that room and told herself she would figure it out later. Later became 8 years. She tried to reach Hazel, but Hazel was already sick by then, and then she was gone, and Opal did not know who to give them to. She had no address for the family, no phone number. She just kept them because throwing them away felt like throwing away a person. Nell listened without interrupting. Then she asked the question she had come to ask, the one that 3 failed batches had made unavoidable. She told Opal about the apple butter, about the 3 attempts, about the gap between the recipe and the flavor, about the thing that was missing. Opal closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she was not looking at Nell, but at something behind her, or past her, or through her. At a kitchen 20 years ago where a woman arrived every month with jars wrapped in cloth and a handshake and never once raised her prices even when Opal told her she should. Her voice carried the quietness of someone sharing a secret they had kept, not because it was dangerous, but because nobody had ever asked. Buckwheat honey, 1 tablespoon, stirred in at the very end after the heat is off while the butter is still hot enough to take it, but not hot enough to cook it. She never wrote it down. She told me once that some things are not recipes. They are instincts. You do not write down an instinct. You pass it hand to hand. Nell sat with that, 1 tablespoon, buckwheat honey, stirred in at the end, a single ingredient that changed everything and was nowhere in the book. Because Hazel believed that the most important things were not the ones you wrote down. They were the ones you carried in your hands and gave to someone standing beside you in the kitchen. The way her grandmother had given her everything else. Not in writing, not in documents, but in the quiet accumulation of mornings spent side by side watching, learning, absorbing what no recipe could hold. She drove to the orchard supply outside Staunton that afternoon and bought a jar of buckwheat honey from a beekeeper who sold it from a card table beside the road. It was dark, almost black, with a flavor that sat somewhere between molasses and earth and the last flowers of summer. She went back to the kitchen. She peeled apples. She cooked them low and slow the way she had learned over 3 failures and a lifetime of watching. She added the cinnamon. She added the cloves. She waited. She stirred. She let the heat do what it needed to do, and for the first time she did not rush it, did not try to make the smell come back faster than it was willing to come, did not stand over the pot, hoping that intensity could replace patience. She just cooked. 8 hours later, she turned off the heat. The butter was thick and dark, and the kitchen smelled like the thing she had been trying to find. Not almost, not adjacent, the thing itself. Cinnamon and clove, and underneath them the sweet dark depth that she had never been able to name, that had lived in her grandmother's kitchen for 50 years and was now here in this kitchen, in this building on this street in Millbrook that she had found, because she stopped her car for no reason she could explain. She stirred in 1 tablespoon of buckwheat honey. She watched it disappear into the butter. She tasted it. She did not move for a long time. It was Hazel's. It was exactly Hazel's. Not a copy, not an approximation. The thing itself, risen out of a copper-bottomed pot in a kitchen that had been closed for 8 years, made by the hands of a woman who had lost everything except a recipe book and a photograph, and the memory of a kitchen on a dirt road where everything real happened. She sealed the jars that night. Wax melted on the stove, poured carefully. The new stamp pressed into the warm surface. CH. The letters were too clean, too precise, but they were there. And the smell that came off the cooling wax, cinnamon and clove and buckwheat honey, and something older than all of those things, filled the kitchen and moved through the doorway into the dining room and out toward the street, where nobody was walking because it was late and the town was quiet, and nobody knew yet what was happening inside. 2 weeks passed, then the call she did not expect. Colleen had been phoning every week since the divorce, asking how Nell was doing, asking about the building, asking what she had found inside, asking whether she had spoken to any lawyers, whether anything had come of the jars, whether she was planning to do anything with the brand. Her voice was warm. Her questions were careful. She sounded like a daughter who was worried about her mother. Nell answered every question. She answered them because Colleen was her daughter, and because after everything that had happened, after losing the house and the car and the life she had built and both of her children's respect, Colleen's weekly calls were the one thread that still connected her to the family she had made. She held on to that thread the way you hold on to something in the dark when you cannot see what else is there. She told Colleen about the lawyer, about Edmund, about the partnership, about the apple butter. She told her everything because she had no reason not to. Every word was being forwarded to Garrett. Colleen Whitfield Burke, 28 years old, married, living in Richmond. She had been monitoring her mother since the day the papers were served, calling on schedule, asking calibrated questions, reporting back to her father what Nell was doing and where she was and what she seemed to be accumulating. When Nell bought the building, Colleen told Garrett within 48 hours. When Nell filed the brand ownership paperwork, Colleen told him about that too. Each call, each question, each answer Nell gave because she trusted her daughter. All of it delivered to the man who had spent 18 months making sure Nell had nothing. Because missing something he did not know existed was a failure Garrett Whitfield could not tolerate. His lawyers filed the challenge in early December. They argued that the brand was discovered during a period when the divorce proceedings had not yet fully concluded and therefore constituted a marital asset subject to equitable division. They cited Colleen's reports as supporting evidence. Her messages to Garrett, sent while she was calling her mother and asking how she was holding up, were included in the court filing. Garrett called Nell himself the night before the hearing. She saw his name on the screen and sat with the phone in her hand for a long time. The kitchen was dark. The jars from the fourth batch were lined up on the counter, the wax seals catching the light from the single bulb above the sink. She could smell them still faintly, the cinnamon and clove and buckwheat honey she had finally learned to put in at the right moment. She looked at his name on the screen and thought about all the times that name had meant something to her safety partnership. Home and how, none of those meanings had survived what he had done to them. She picked up. He said her name softly the way he used to say it when he wanted something, and had learned that softness worked better than directness. He said the brand was not worth the fight. He said they could settle this quietly, privately, without lawyers and courtrooms and public records. He said he was not trying to hurt her. He said he just wanted what was fair. Nell did not respond immediately. She let his words sit in the kitchen like something spilled on the counter that nobody had cleaned up. Then she spoke, and her voice was not loud and was not soft and carried nothing in it that he would have recognized as the woman he had been married to for 30 years, because that woman had signed papers without reading them and trusted without verifying, and believed that a shared life meant shared ownership. And this woman had sealed 31 jars of apple butter with her own hands and pressed 2 letters into warm wax and learned the one ingredient her grandmother never wrote down. You took the house, you took the car, you took 30 years of my work and structured it so my name was on none of it. You had 18 months to decide what was fair. You already decided. He started to say something. Do not call me again. She set the phone down on the counter. She did not hang up. She just set it down and let whatever he was saying go on in the dark until he stopped. Then she picked it up and ended the call and put the phone in the drawer beneath the counter and left it there for the night. The hearing was held in the Staunton courthouse on a Tuesday morning in January. The courtroom was small. Nell sat on one side with Faye Beckford. Garrett sat on the other with 2 lawyers in suits that cost more than Nell's car. He did not look at her. He looked at the table in front of him the way a man looks at a desk when he already knows the paperwork is not going to go his way. The judge read the manufacturing agreement. She read the date. October 14th, 1985. She read the marriage certificate date. June 8th, 1981. She read the relevant statute of Virginia property law regarding inherited separate assets acquired before marriage. She looked at Garrett's lawyer. She looked at Garrett. She closed the folder. 2 words spoken without emphasis, without drama, with the flat certainty of a legal system that occasionally gets to do exactly what it was designed to do, challenge dismissed. Garrett's lawyers billed him $34,000 for the filing. The filing was public record. Every document submitted to the court was accessible to anyone who knew where to look. The messages from Colleen to Garrett, timestamp dated sent during or immediately after phone calls to her mother, were part of the supporting evidence. They were now part of the public record, too. Colleen's husband found them online 3 days after the hearing. He was not looking for them. He was checking a property listing on the county record site when a link to the case filing appeared in the sidebar. He saw the name Whitfield. He clicked. He read his wife's name in the supporting documents. He read the messages she had sent to her father. He read the dates and the times, and he cross-referenced them without meaning to, with his own memory of evenings when Colleen had been on the phone in the living room. Her voice gentle, asking her mother how she was holding up, and then afterward putting the phone down and saying something about how worried she was. Heinz sat at the kitchen table in their house in Richmond and put the phone face down on the surface and did not pick it up again for a long time. 3 weeks later, Colleen called Nell. Her voice was different. The careful warmth was gone. Underneath it was something raw and unstructured. Not the voice of a woman who had been caught, but the voice of a woman who had just discovered that being caught has consequences that extend beyond the person you betrayed. She needed somewhere to go. Nell listened to the entire call without saying a word. She let her daughter talk. She let her explain. She let her reach the end of whatever she had prepared to say. And then she let the silence sit for a moment longer than was comfortable, because some silences need to be felt before they are filled. Her voice, when it came, carried no anger, and no satisfaction, and no forgiveness. Only the sound of a woman who had learned what it costs to trust the wrong person, and was not willing to pay that price again. You did not call me when I needed somewhere to go. She ended the call. Garrett had spent 30 years using legal structures to take things from people. He had done it to Nell. He had done it to others. The others came forward when the federal investigation opened. Nell never filed a complaint. The investigation opened because of a pattern that Garrett's legal architecture could no longer contain once it was examined in a courtroom, rather than the privacy of a closing meeting. 3 other parties, similar structures, similar paperwork, similar results, similar signatures on documents designed to make assets disappear from one name and reappear in another. Nolan Whitfield, 31 years old, 6 years at the firm, senior associate. He had signed the documents. He had known what he was signing. He had done it because he believed his father's legal team had made everything untouchable, and because Nolan had spent his entire adult life positioning himself near the money and assuming that proximity was the same thing as protection. It was not. The same documents that were supposed to shield Garrett became the evidence trail, and Nolan's name was on them. Clear dated his handwriting on transfers that a federal investigator could follow in an afternoon. Nolan called Nell when the investigation opened, not to apologize, to ask whether she had spoken to investigators, whether she had filed anything, whether there was anything she could do. Nell listened to the entire call. Then she said she had not filed anything and had not spoken to anyone, and that whatever was happening to him, he had built himself. She ended the call. 8 months after the divorce, on a night when Nell was alone in the kitchen cleaning the prep counter, after a long day of testing recipes with Edmund's team, her phone lit up with a text from a number she had not seen in months. Birdie Calloway. The message was short. No greeting, no preamble, no ask. I just wanted you to know I never stopped thinking about you. You were always good to me. Nell read it 3 times before she called back. Birdie had worked in the Whitfield household for 14 years. She had seen things in that house she was not supposed to see, late-night phone calls. Garrett took in his office with the door closed. Bank statements left on the printer that showed accounts. Nell's name was not on. A pattern of behavior that Birdie recognized, not because she was trained to recognize it, but because she had spent 14 years in a house, and you learn the shape of a marriage, the way you learn the layout of the rooms. She had gone to Nell quietly, not with proof, not with accusations, just with a sentence spoken in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, while folding laundry. Her eyes on the towels and her voice careful and low. Something does not feel right about the accounts, and you should pay attention. Nell had not fully heard it at the time. She was too deep inside the life she had built to see what was being done to it from the inside. She heard it later, sitting in a lawyer's office, understanding that the money had been moved and the house was gone. And the man she had trusted for 30 years had spent 18 months preparing to leave her with nothing. Birdie was the only person who tried to warn her. Garrett had fired her the week the papers were served. No conversation, no notice, no severance. A text from his assistant that read her services were no longer required. 14 years and a text from an assistant. Birdie had spent 8 months cleaning rooms at a hotel in Staunton. Less money, no benefits, early mornings making beds and scrubbing bathrooms for people who walked past her without looking up from their phones. She sent the text to Nell because she heard through someone in town that a woman named Whitfield had bought the old Opal stable building on the main street in Millbrook, and she wanted Nell to know she was thinking of her. She did not need anything in return. She just wanted her to know. Nell called her back that night and talked to her for 40 minutes. She did not offer her anything, not yet. She just talked. Two women on the phone in the dark, one in a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and clove. One in a studio apartment that smelled like hotel cleaning solution. Both of them quiet for long stretches because they had learned that silence between people who trust each other is not empty. It is the opposite of empty. 2 days later, Nolan's real estate license was suspended, pending the investigation. At 31 years old, his name was attached to a federal case and an industry that runs on reputation. Nobody in Virginia commercial real estate would return his calls. The career he had spent 6 years building on his father's architecture was gone in the time it takes for a federal filing to appear in a database. Garrett lost the firm the same week. The woman from his office, the one he had left Nell for, left him the month the investigation went public. She had never been there for him. She had been there for what he represented. What he represented was gone. Nell heard about it the way people hear about things in small communities through someone who heard from someone who read it in the court records. She did not call. She did not reach out. She sat in the kitchen of the restaurant on the main street in Millbrook, with 31 jars of her grandmother's apple butter on the shelf behind her, and the recipe book open on the counter, and the photograph of Hazel still tucked inside the front cover. And she did not feel satisfaction. She did not feel vindication. She felt the particular heaviness of watching someone you once loved become exactly what they built. That night, she sat alone in the kitchen after the lights were off. The jars were dark shapes on the shelf. The wax seals caught no light because there was no light to catch. The smell of cinnamon and clove hung in the air the way it always did now. So constant she sometimes forgot it was there until a moment like this when everything else was quiet and the smell was the only thing left. Both of her children were on the other side. Colleen, who had called every week and forwarded every word. Nolan, who had signed every document and called only to ask what she might say to investigators. Garrett, who had taken everything and then come back for the one thing he missed. All of them on the other side of something she could not cross and did not want to cross and would not try to cross. She was alone in a way that was not temporary. She understood that now. This was not loneliness waiting to be fixed. This was the shape of a life after the people you built it around chose to take it apart. She sat in the dark kitchen with her grandmother's jars and her grandmother's recipe and her grandmother's photograph. And she did not cry because she had done her crying months ago in a rented room with a folder on the nightstand. And what she felt now was not grief. It was something quieter, something that sat deeper. The feeling of standing on ground that has shifted beneath you and realizing that the only thing left to build on is whatever you can carry in your own hands. The jars on the shelf, the recipe in the book, the seal pressed into wax, the smell of cinnamon and clove. That was what she had. That was all she had. She did not know yet whether it was enough. She went back to the kitchen the next morning because there was nowhere else to go. Not in the way of a woman who had run out of options, in the way of a woman who had finally stopped looking for somewhere else. The kitchen was the only room in her life that had not lied to her. The stove did what she asked it to do. The apples became what she made them become. The wax melted and hardened and held, and the letters she pressed into it stayed. And the smell that came off the cooling jars was the same smell every time as cinnamon and clove and buckwheat honey. And it did not change its mind, and it did not restructure itself in the middle of the night. And it did not call her from a one-bedroom apartment asking for something it had spent 30 years taking. She peeled apples, she cooked, she sealed, she did it again. Birdie showed up on the third morning. She did not call ahead, she did not knock. She came through the back door the way someone enters a room. They have already decided belongs to them, not with permission, but with purpose. And she tied an apron around her waist and started washing the prep counter without saying a word. Nell looked up from the stove. Birdie looked back. Neither of them spoke for a while because there was nothing to say that the act of showing up had not already said. They worked side by side for 3 days before Nell brought it up. They were cleaning the dining room, wiping down the tables. Opal's customers had eaten at 20 years ago, pulling the chairs down from where they had been stacked since the doors closed. Birdie was working on the windows, peeling the paper backing off the glass with a razor blade and the spray bottle. And the afternoon light came through each cleared pane in long rectangles that moved across the floor as the hours passed. Nell watched her work and thought about 14 years of watching this woman move through the house on Bellevue Drive, quiet and steady, seeing everything. Saying almost nothing until the one morning she said the thing that mattered. Nell set the rag down on the table and asked Birdie to sit. Birdie sat. She folded her hands on the table the way she always did when she was waiting for someone to tell her something patient, still giving the other person whatever time they needed. Nell spoke carefully, not because the words were difficult, but because she wanted them to land the way they deserved to. Without rushing, without the noise of gratitude that sometimes makes the person receiving it feel smaller rather than larger. You tried to warn me when nobody else did. You saw what was happening in that house, and you came to me and you told me the truth, even though telling me could have cost you the only income you had. And it did cost you. He fired you for it. 14 years and a text from his assistant. Birdie started to say it was nothing. It was not nothing. Nell's voice did not rise, but it did not give ground either. This restaurant has a place for you, a real one, with your name on the board and benefits and everything that should have come with 14 years of showing up for someone. Birdie sat very still. Her hands stayed folded on the table. Her eyes stayed on Nell's. She did not look away, and she did not look down, and she did not do the thing that people sometimes do when they are offered something they have stopped believing they deserve, which is to make themselves smaller, so the offer has somewhere to land. She stayed exactly the size she was. Her voice was quiet, but it held. I just did not want you to be blindsided. Nell nodded. I know. That is why you are here. Birdie had not had health insurance in 11 years. Her name went on the staff board the morning the building's permit was approved. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Nell had not experienced in 30 years. The rhythm of building something that belonged to her. She and Edmund's team worked on the menu. Not a large menu, not a complicated one. Comfort food rooted in the valley. The kind of cooking Hazel had done, the kind Opal had served for 20 years, the kind that does not need a mission statement or a brand narrative, because the food itself is the statement. Apple butter on fresh bread, biscuits and gravy, chicken and dumplings made the way. Nell's grandmother made them with the dough pinched by hand and dropped into the broth in pieces that were deliberately uneven, because uniformity was for factories and this was a kitchen. Edmund provided the distribution infrastructure. His team handled the supply chain, the sourcing, the logistics of getting Combs Hollow Original into jars and onto shelves in stores across the valley. He did not try to change the recipe. He did not suggest modifications for shelf life or flavor consistency, or any of the things that men in his position usually suggest when they are partnered with a woman who makes food by hand in a kitchen that smells like her grandmother. I understood that the value of what Nell had was precisely that it could not be optimized. It could only be made by hand, one batch at a time, one tablespoon of buckwheat honey stirred in at the end. Nell drove to Waynesboro every Tuesday. She and Miss Opal sat together in the small room at the end of the East Wing and talked about Hazel, about the monthly deliveries wrapped in cloth, about the customers who came to Opal's table specifically for the apple butter and stayed for the biscuits, about the way Hazel asked about each customer by name, even though she had never met most of them, because Opal wrote about them in her letters. And Hazel remembered every name and every story, because that is what you do when you care about the people your food reaches, even if you never see their faces. The monthly payment arrangement was drawn up the following week. Not legally required. Miss Opal had sold the building fair and square, but she had kept those jars for 8 years without knowing who they belonged to. And she had held on to them because every jar still held the warmth of the hands that sealed it. And you do not discard something like that, not if you have any sense of what matters. Nell understood that some debts are not financial. Some debts are the kind you repay by showing up every Tuesday with a fresh jar of apple butter and sitting with an 83-year-old woman who held on to your grandmother's legacy because she could not bear to let it go. The news about Garrett came in pieces, the way bad news always comes when it is happening to someone you used to know. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but in fragments that accumulate over weeks until the full picture is visible and you realize it was forming the whole time. I lost the firm first. The investigation froze the accounts. The clients left, not slowly, not one by one, with apologetic phone calls and promises to return when things settled down. They left the way people leave a building when they smell smoke quickly, without looking back, without taking their things. 30 years of handshakes and dinners and deals structured on trust that turned out to be architecture, not trust at all. His license followed. The board acted faster than anyone expected because the evidence was not ambiguous and because the pattern was not something that could be explained away as a misunderstanding or a clerical error. It was a pattern. 3 other parties. Similar structures, similar documents, similar results. The woman from the office, the one 28 years younger. The one who had seen in Garrett what Nell had once seen left him the month the investigation became public record. She did not call, she did not explain. She simply stopped being there the way a reflection disappears when you turn off the light. She had been there for what he represented. What he represented had a federal case number now. Nolan lost his license before his career had properly started. At 31, his name was in a federal database, and an industry that runs on reputation had decided his name was not one they wanted on their letterhead. He called no one. No one called him. Garrett ended up in a one-bedroom apartment in a complex outside Harrisonburg with a federal case pending and the silence around him. That was not the silence of privacy, but the silence of a man nobody needed to talk to anymore. He called Nell once from that apartment. She saw his name on the screen and set the phone face down on the counter and left it there until the ringing stopped. He called Nolan. Nolan did not answer. Garrett was no longer useful to his son, and Nolan had only ever engaged with people who were useful. Garrett sat in that apartment and understood for the first time what it felt like to build 30 years of something and watch it mean nothing to the people who were supposed to love you. He had built exactly what he deserved. Nell did not think about him often. When she did, it was not with anger, and it was not with pity, and it was not with the complicated mixture of both that she had expected to feel for the rest of her life. It was with the flat, clear recognition of a woman who has finally seen the full shape of something she spent 30 years standing too close to see. He had taken everything he could see. He had missed everything that mattered. And the distance between those two things, between what he could see and what actually mattered, was the distance between a one-bedroom apartment in Harrisonburg and the kitchen in Millbrook, where a woman was pressing her grandmother's initials into warm wax and building something real. The sign went up on a Saturday morning in late March. Nell and Birdie carried it out of the back of Edmund's truck and leaned it against the front of the building and looked at it for a while before they hung it. Combs Hollow Kitchen, below the name in smaller letters, Est, 1985, the year Hazel signed the manufacturing agreements, the year the brand became official. Not the year Nell opened the restaurant. The year her grandmother started something that would take 40 years to find its way to the right hands. They hung it together. Birdie held the ladder. Nell drilled the bolts. The sign was not large. It did not need to be. It said what it needed to say. The morning of the opening, Nell arrived before dawn. She let herself in through the back door and stood in the kitchen alone. The prep counter was clean. The stove was ready. The jars of Combs Hollow Original were lined up on the shelf behind the service window. 31 of them. The original 31, each one still sealed with Hazel's wax, each one bearing the handwritten label in ink that had faded but not disappeared. Nell had decided not to sell those. They were not inventory. They were evidence. Evidence that a woman on a dirt road in the Shenandoah Valley had bottled something real and trusted it to last, and it had lasted. The new jars, the ones Nell had made, were on every table. Smaller with fresh labels printed by Edmund's team, but sealed the same way. Wax melted and poured by hand. The brass stamp pressed into the warm surface. CH. The letters were still too clean, still too precise, but they were there. She opened the recipe book. She turned to the front cover. She took out the photograph she had carried for 30 years. Hazel May Combs, 33 years old, standing in front of the kitchen on Combs Hollow Road, a jar of apple butter in each hand, smiling like she knew something nobody else knew yet. Nell had the photograph framed that morning. She walked down the main street to the hardware store before it opened, and the owner, who had seen the sign go up and had been watching the building come back to life over the past months, with the particular attention of a man who has lived in a small town long enough to know when something matters, opened early for her. Plain wood frame, clean glass, nothing decorative. She carried it back to the restaurant herself and hung it on the wall beside the kitchen door, where every person who walked in would pass it. She stepped back and looked at the photograph on the wall. Hazel at 33, Nell at 58. 25 years between them in those pictures, and yet standing here in a kitchen that smelled exactly like the one on Combs Hollow Road, the distance collapsed. She was 11 years old again, standing on a step stool beside the stove, watching her grandmother stir. She was 23, driving away with a recipe book in her lap and the photograph she would carry for 3 decades without understanding what it was. She was 58, standing in a restaurant she bought with her last dollar. And for the first time since the morning Garrett's lawyer had called, she felt the ground beneath her feet hold. Not shift, not tilt, not restructure itself into something she could not recognize. Hold. The way the floor of her grandmother's kitchen had held. The way the wax on those jars had held. The way some things, if they are made with enough care, simply hold. The line stretched down the sidewalk before the doors opened. People who had watched the sign go up. People who had smelled something from the street during the weeks of testing and made a note to come back. People who had heard about the apple butter through someone who heard about it through someone else. The word moving quietly and steadily through Millbrook and the valley beyond it, until the whole town knew that the building that had been dark for 8 years was not dark anymore. And the woman inside it was making something that smelled like a place you had been once and could not quite remember, but wanted to find again. Nell opened the doors at 11. By noon, every table was full. The kitchen was running. Birdie moved through the dining room the way she moved through every room, with the calm, attentive certainty of a woman who had spent her life taking care of spaces and was finally in one that took care of her back. The sounds of a full restaurant filled every corner of the building, plates and conversation and laughter, and the particular warm noise that only happens when people are eating food that someone made with their hands and their time and their full attention. The smell moved through every room. Cinnamon and clove and buckwheat honey and fresh bread and chicken broth and the accumulated warmth of a kitchen that had been waiting 8 years for someone to come back and turn on the stove. Before the dinner service began, Nell went to the kitchen alone. She stood in front of the shelf where the original 31 jars were lined up. She looked at the labels, her grandmother's handwriting, her grandmother's name, the wax seals that Hazel had pressed by hand with a stamp made from a spent rifle casing, each one bearing the letters that meant the road and the kitchen, and the woman who stood at the stove every morning before the sun came up and did not leave until everything was done. She touched one jar. The wax was cool and smooth under her fingers. The letters C and H were shallow impressions in a surface that had been soft once and had hardened into something permanent, the way all things that are made with care eventually harden into something that lasts longer than the hands that made them. She did not say anything. She did not need to. When the restaurant was full and every table was taken, and the sound of people eating and talking filled every room, Birdie appeared at Nell's shoulder. They stood together in the kitchen doorway and looked out at what they had built. A room full of people eating food that almost never made it out of a storage room. A jar of apple butter on every table, sealed with wax stamped with 2 letters that meant a woman on a dirt road who bottled something real and trusted it would find its way. A photograph on the wall of that woman, 33 years old. A jar in each hand, smiling, hanging beside the kitchen door, where the light from the dining room caught the glass and made it glow. Nell stood in a restaurant she bought with her last dollar, on a street she had never driven down before the day her marriage ended. Her grandmother's name above the kitchen door, her grandmother's recipe on every plate. The recipe book, the one Garrett never once opened in 30 years of living in the same house as the woman who carried it, was on the shelf beside the original jars, closed its pages full of handwriting that recorded not just recipes, but a life, a way of being in the world that had nothing to do with deeds or account balances or trust documents, and everything to do with the simple, stubborn act of making something with your hands and believing it mattered. Neither Birdie nor Nell said much. They did not need to. Some things do not need to be spoken to be understood. They need only to be witnessed. 2 women standing in a doorway looking out at a room full of strangers who had come because something in the air smelled like a place they wanted to be, eating food made from a recipe that had been carried in a book for 30 years by a woman who did not know what it was worth. Sealed with wax by hands that had learned the one ingredient that was never written down in a building that had been dark for 8 years and was not dark anymore. Garrett took the house, he took the car, he took 30 years of labor and structured it so her name was on none of it. He left her with $21,000 and the recipe book. He thought he left her with nothing. He left her with everything. Because the one thing he never understood about Nell The one thing he could not take, because he could not see it, was where she came from. Her grandmother's kitchen on Combs Hollow Road. Those recipes, that apple butter. The photograph tucked inside the front cover of a book he never once opened. He had every advantage. He had lawyers and 18 months and every asset restructured in his name. And he still missed the thing that mattered. You cannot take what you cannot see. Some people spend their whole lives chasing what they can put their name on. Nell inherited something much harder to steal. A recipe, a story. A grandmother who bottled her whole life into 31 jars and sealed each one with wax and pressed 2 letters into the surface and trusted that the right person would find them. The people who only see what something is worth on paper will always miss what actually matters. And by the time they realize it, it is already too late. Outside, the last light of the March evening moved across the valley and caught the ridge of the Blue Ridge in a line of gold that held for a moment, and then softened into the long blue dusk that gives the mountains their name. Inside, the kitchen was warm. The jars were on the shelf. The photograph was on the wall. The smell of cinnamon and clove moved through every room and out the front door and into the street, where it mixed with the evening air and the smell of the orchards beginning to wake after winter. And anyone walking past who did not know what was inside would have stopped anyway, because some things do not need a sign to tell you they are there. You just know, the way you know when you have come home. If this story made you think about the things in your life that nobody else sees, the recipe your mother never wrote down, the photograph you have carried for years without framing, the small quiet thing you inherited, that no document can measure, send it to someone who needs to hear it. If someone spent 30 years taking from you, your house, your savings, your name on nothing, and then faced every consequence of what they built, would you forgive them? Or would you let them sit with what they made? Leave your answer below. Subscribe to this channel. We will see you in the next one.